Hello, my name is Nicastro, and I have the social and cultural lens. This is Nalevanko with the economic lens, and Anna Maris with the historical and political lens, and our topic was the war on drugs. In 1971, Richard Nixon began the war on drugs, which was an anti-drug initiative that used harsher drug policies to wipe drugs off the streets, but instead of doing more good, it ended up doing more harm. September 14, 1986, Nancy Reagan continued the war on drugs with her Just Say No campaign. This campaign, again, like Nixon's, ended up doing more harm, and it caused a society that targeted minority communities and resulted in mass incarceration. In 1980, incarceration rates were much lower than they are now. There were about 50,000 people in jail at that time, but by 2016, that number has skyrocketed to almost 450,000, with 67% of those prisoners being African American. Because of the excessive numbers of minorities in U.S. prisons, we ask ourselves, should America continue its war on drugs? And our research concluded that no, America should not continue its war on drugs because it has created a society that targets and negatively affects minority communities.
I researched this topic through the political and historical lens. My thesis was that the United States should not continue its war on drugs because it has heavily targeted and disadvantages minority communities in the United States. Since Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971, drug policies have been used to target minority communities in the United States. Several presidents have enacted anti-drug legislation that has proven to be much more harmful than helpful. One of these pieces of legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, was enacted under the Reagan administration. Mark Lamont Hill, who works for the American Civil Liberties Union Drug Reform Project, explains how this act led to sentencing disparities in the criminal justice system. The act set differential sentencing laws for crack and powder cocaine. This created sentencing disparities since the cheaply priced crack was more popular among poor black drug users, while the more expensive powder cocaine was used more frequently in richer white communities. Another policy, which is used by police officers in the war on drugs, is the stop and frisk rule. The rule states that if and when a police officer observes unusual conduct by someone, the officer is then entitled to conduct a limited search of the person. This policy has allowed officers to stop and question a person they believe is engaging in criminal activity even without probable cause. Michelle Alexander, a highly acclaimed legal scholar and civil rights lawyer, states that this policy has led to more than 31 million arrests for nonviolent drug offenses as of 2010. As discovered in my research, the policies of the war on drugs have allowed racial profiling and discrimination to be used against minority communities in the United States, and it has led to them being incarcerated at historically unprecedented rates.
I researched our topic through the economic lens, and my research has uncovered that the United States should not continue its war on drugs because it financially disables impoverished minority communities. Since former President Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971, the United States has spent over $1 trillion on this drug war, with only 2 cents of each dollar used for treatment and prevention. The process of civil asset forfeiture, a commonly used process among law enforcement agents in the war on drugs, allows law enforcement to seize assets thought to be used in criminal activity. The Lucy Parsons Lab, a nonprofit organization that researches injustices in Chicago, analyzed over 23,000 civil asset forfeitures. They discovered that the Chicago Police Department seized between $4 and $9 million from citizens through civil asset forfeitures every year. The majority of the victims were black low-income citizens who were not found guilty of illegal drug use or were not found with drugs on their person. Once released from prison, ex-convicts will earn less money than non-incarcerated people and will have difficulty finding employment. Adam Looney, a senior fellow of economic studies at the Brookings Institute, and Nicholas Turner, a senior economist at the Federal Reserve System, researched the income of ex-convicts 1 year after their release. During that year, only 55% reported earnings, and those with jobs, the median yearly earnings were about $10,000, and only 20% earned more than $15,000. Ultimately, the United States should not continue its war on drugs because it financially disables impoverished minority communities. My research concluded that America should not continue its war on drugs because it has created a society that targets minority communities and doesn't give them a way to advance socially. One way they do this is the stereotypes that go along with drug use. It is a common stereotype that all drug users are minorities, or all minorities are drug users. And an example of this is a Time magazine article, or Time magazine that was published May 13, 1991, which displayed a Latino boy on the cover titled Crack Kids. And this went along that same stereotype that because they are minorities, they are automatically assumed to be involved with drugs. And this is backed up by Deborah Small, a psychology professor at Wharton University, who says that even though African Americans only make up 13% of all drug users, they are 35% of the drug users in U.S. prisons right now. And because of the excessive amounts minorities are stereotyped and arrested, they also suffer the consequences of incarceration much more than other races. According to Sarah Wakefield, Associate Professor at Rutgers School of Criminal Justice, and Christopher Wilderman, Associate Professor at Cornell University, children with incarcerated parents exhibit 33% more behavioral issues than children without a parent that is incarcerated. And these behavioral issues don't just stop at a young age. They can follow them into adulthood, where they can have trouble finding a higher education or getting an honest job. And according to Diane and Edward Reed, who are authors of many articles in the Social Justice Journal, a large proportion of these same kids with incarcerated parents will engage in criminal activity. And because of this, because these minorities are stereotyped and imprisoned more, resulting in their children being imprisoned more, the minority communities are just in a detrimental loop because of the war on drugs. Although the war on drugs has had more negative outcomes than positive, several politicians still voice their support for its continuation. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, declared the opioid crisis a national emergency in a 2017 speech. Trump highlights the importance of enforcing the law and arresting drug dealers, making it clear that he supports past drug control policies used in the war on drugs. However, his approach to ending the war on drugs by enforcing policies that have been proven to be ineffective in the past will only worsen the drug problem. Arresting and locking up more drug criminals will not win us the drug war, as it will only add to the number of blacks and Latinos ending up in U.S. prison systems. Jody Whitley, who has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, argues that heavier drug laws will do more harm than good. The majority of people arrested for drug use are not educated on their actions, so the harsher drug laws will not change their course of action. He also argues that harsher drug laws can, quote, serve as an incentive to commit further violent acts, because criminals who are aware of the new law may be more violent or desperate when officers try to arrest them.
This brings us to our team solutions. Doug McVeigh, founder of Drug War Distortions, proposes sending drug offenders to rehabilitation centers as an alternative to incarceration. A potential limitation to this is that numerous drug offenders relapse, which could result in a short-term prison sentence. However, McVeigh states that New York's rehabilitation programs have significantly reduced recidivism and drug use rates, increase the chances of finding employment, and save money over the cost of incarceration. New York has reported that rehabilitation treatments are about half the cost of imprisoning someone for the average term. This brings us to our next solution. Stephen Rolls, a policy analyst at the drug reform organization Transform, proposes legalizing and regulating certain drugs as a possible solution to the failed war on drugs. He explains that this will decrease the harm by placing the drugs in the hands of government officials who can appropriately control and regulate them. This solution has been proven to work in Portugal, where drug use among young people has fallen since all drugs were decriminalized in 2001. The limitation to this is that creating a government-controlled system that has the most benefits and the least risk to regulating drugs could likely be very challenging and costly. However, Ethan Nadelman, founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, explains that decriminalizing and regulating certain drugs will improve public safety, save taxpayer money, eliminate black markets, and reduce crime rates and violence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anna, we're going to start with you and then move right to left per the camera. So first question then. Anna, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Olivia's findings.
Well, my thinking changed as a result of Olivia's findings because her research was mostly about the social effects on prisoners, in prison and after release, and even the effects on their children. And this really put my research into perspective because mine was more about the legal aspects and the policies and the numbers of people who are incarcerated, but her research focused more on the social effects and the things that a lot of people a lot of times don't think about, like you can't find a job after being incarcerated, and it's hard to succeed in life, and it's harder to get married. I think all of her research and her claims really put my research into perspective and made me think differently.
Okay, thanks. Lily, reflecting on your partner's work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem?
I would say Anna's lens and perspective had the greatest impact on my understanding of our problem, because in one of her claims, she highlights the stop and frisk rule, which allows police officers to stop any citizen who looks suspicious or they look like they're committing criminal activities. And this made me think differently about our problem, because overall, this made me think differently because she talks about the stop and frisk rule, and I talked about how civil asset forfeitures take money. So I thought about how historically, her stop and frisk rule allowed police officers to discriminate against minority communities, whereas mine discriminated against them economically, and it just was interesting to see the comparison.
Okay. All right, thanks. Olivia, so in the future, what change would you make to your group's norms, and how would you expect to improve the team's presentation?
Overall, I would say during the actual research process, I would probably have us talk more, because especially with the lens we use, there could be some overlap in some areas, and to avoid that, talking more during the actual research process, I think would have helped us a lot.
Okay. All right, thank you.